to another edition of the Holden Village podcast, another special edition of Holden Main Street. I am with our wonderful naturalist, Nic Caddell. How would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps say one inspiring thing that's happened to you in the last 48 hours?
Hi, I'm Nic. I'm the resident naturalist here, which is a pretty sweet gig.
That seems like the best gig in the village.
Yeah. I get to focus on areas of my own interest and then share that with other people. So I get to do research on whatever ecological topics feel particularly pertinent or interesting, especially as it relates to this valley. And then I get to teach that and develop curriculum and share that with other people. That's a little overview of my job. I would say one thing that was really inspiring to me actually was going to Lyd Wilk's Artist Talk. Conversations about creating art that isn't for utility in a medium like ceramics that has traditionally been used in many circumstances for utility. So yeah, it was really interesting to hear how they're integrating kind of narratives about commentary on the climate crisis and utilizing trash and upcycling materials to incorporate that into their art. That was really cool to witness.
Well, Lyd's a total badass. Yeah. So shout out to Lyd in this podcast. Do you have a particular art form that you resonate with?
Well, for most of my life, I was training as a dancer. I started training in classical ballet when I was 5 and did that for many years. I don't dance with a company anymore, but in college got to do a lot more kind of experimental stuff with improvisational dance and contact improvisation and kind of dance in group settings and collectively creating something together. And that was very fruitful. So I'm kind of in a place of developing my own practice around dance now and not having it be such a rigid thing, which has a give and take to it. Totally. I like having structure in that way, but it's also really cool to just explore. And one of the things I've been doing with that is exploring dancing in natural spaces and kind of utilizing or interacting with what's around me, rocks, trees, etc., water, to see how that changes and influences bodily movement.
Wonderful.
So that's been a lot of fun. I go down to the creek by myself a lot and dance down there.
Creek dance, that's the best.
I taught a class at one point with another staff member on plant dancing and learning how to kind of characterize or demonstrate through embodied movement the character of different plants as a way of identifying them. So that was really fun.
Well, that's like the most amazing thing ever. And that makes me think of so many different things. I used to do Sufi dances, the mystical aspect of Islam. They have like the whirling dervishes, and they have these different practices, particularly of connecting the stars to the earth. And so they'd have these like different gestures that they would do, and they would point to different celestial bodies and kind of like take it from this hand and then like ground it in this hand into the earth, and then you kind of become this medium point. I know they've done other focused dances on like different, not necessarily plant forms, but like terrains. Yeah, the desert dance, like the rain dances. That's so fascinating.
Yeah. I like it a lot.
Well, I would love to join one of your plant dances whenever it's happening.
You should.
That also makes me think of, so acoustics is really important to me, and so how sound helps things grow. And so there's been a lot of research on how different frequencies can help plants grow in certain ways, and a lot of that research was done in the 60s and 70s. So
talking to them and singing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we have to.
Yeah, it's almost like they can perceive things.
Fancy that, right?
Know. Wild notion. Yeah.
So, okay, do you have a specific plant that you really resonate with, or that you've been dancing for this summer, or dancing to?
This is such a hard question for me. I've been
it's like, who's your favorite kid, right?
Yeah. It's like I'm a botanist.
Well, for this summer specifically.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's pare it down.
That's still really hard. Okay.
I won't tell them. All right. Like.
Yeah. Well, on the dancing side of things, the Western red cedars I've been paying a lot of attention to.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, they're a really cool treat for a lot of reasons, but in terms of movement, they catch the wind in a really interesting way, and so it's kind of fun, either if you're lying underneath them or just watching them even from a distance, more in silhouette. When wind comes through them, it looks like they're dancing to me.
Excellent.
And so it's kind of fun to like see that in another living being, and then it's the same way as like when I go and watch dance performances. I love watching dance performances, but it's also painful because I have to sit still and watch other people dance.
Sure.
And I want to be involved. And it's kind of the same with the tree. Like, I
start to see them dancing, and then you get to have all the fun, right?
Yeah. So one plant that has really amazed me this summer, that I know a different variety of this plant exists where I grew up, but I had never paid it that much attention. They are very present here right now in the forest, especially the wolverine fire.
The wolverine fire,
Ceanothus. And I think the variety we have here is Ceanothus velutinus, but it's a shrub or kind of a bush with kind of shiny, roundish leaves. Earlier in in the early summer, late spring, you might have smelled them. They smell really good when they bloom. They have these big white blooms. They're related to lilac, so kind of
Gotcha.
But they're everywhere right now. And part of that, the reason for that is that they have a really cool fire adaptation. Their seeds will lie dormant in the ground for up to 300 years.
That's badass.
Waiting for fire to come through. And they need fire before their seeds will germinate and grow. But they're one of the kind of early successional plants that will come back after fire and help to restabilize the soil and build the plant community back up. So eventually, trees come back in and they cycle out again, and their seeds will just lie dormant. And so you might have a forest where you haven't seen any Ceanothus in decades, if not hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden a fire will come through and it's everywhere. So that's been really cool to get to know them a little better.
Totally. So you were mentioning, the scent of you say Ceanothus? Ceanothus.
Mm-hmm.
Our senses are like our maps to the world.
Sure.
And we tend to have ones that we gravitate more towards.
Yeah.
Are there specific ones that you gravitate towards?
Definitely touch. Like I joke sometimes that like as a scientist, I guess I don't do things the way that science sometimes prescribes.
Excellent.
And I think
congratulations.
The reason I'm a good scientist is that I'm not just out there trying to like collect data. I'm not a subject that's has objects that I'm learning about. For me, science is like a form of communion. It's a way of deepening personal relationships with other living beings and getting to know them. And I don't think that you can just do that through quantitative measures. Often, like when I first go on a hike or I'm first keying a plant that I don't know yet, before I try and use any scientific language to describe them, I try and talk about them like someone I'm just meeting. So describing quirks or thinking about why they might like to call that particular place home. Often that involves using a lot of other senses to get to know them. And so touch is very important in that process. And also using my senses to see how they are in relationship with other living beings. Like it's never really made sense to me to study organisms in isolation.
Right.
They don't exist in isolation, but they're not in a void. To me, like ecology and being an ecologist is about studying the relationships that exist between organisms that actually are the reason they compose organisms. We're composed of so many different organisms. One of those relationships, as soon as I start to get to know them, is between the two of us. I think touch and smell is important to me too. That connects it to memory, and then I'm able to make that connection each time. If I walk down the trail, I am often in my head or out loud naming whatever I'm seeing, which has gotten, it's a great habit, but it also has gotten more consuming the longer I've been botanist.
Yeah, right. You're like,
Now I know a lot of plants.
That's fantastic, because that's also, I mean, that's, you know, with our summer theme, like Eden is calling, like part of the Eden myth is like the naming of things, which is also the way that I interpret it. It's not the mainline interpretation, is that it's like they're discovering like the frequency of an animal or a plant, like a sound, like not like a abstract name like tiger. You know, it's the actual embodiment of that being, which is obviously a very complex array of many sounds. But I think in a lot of mystical traditions, that was a part of their process. Even in like the Australian Aboriginal like dream walking tradition, where like they would like go out on their walkabout and they would just start naming things.
Yeah.
But like the actual essence of like that thing as well.
Right.
And so, yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of indigenous languages, the names of things are place-based. They say something about where that being exists or how they exist.
Exactly. I love that you said that science is a process of communion for you, and that's how I feel as well. I think in a different life I would have been a mad scientist, because I love scientific processes and discovering how things are connected.
Yeah.
Did you go to any of Saskia DeVries's, she was like the neurology of sight?
Oh, sadly, no. I did terrible scheduling that weekend.
It's okay. No one knows.
Every time.
Nobody knows how to schedule at Holden. It's just a hodgepodge of madness. I just released their podcast, so you might be interested in hearing that. Definitely. But they just had the most incredible way of describing not only their scientific process, but also what twilight means, and how twilight is this space of the coming together of darkness and light, but also how it's a place that's really not for humans. Like, it's a place where like crepuscular animals can see various things that are beyond humans' perception. They put that as a queer space during the day. And not that has to, like, you know, humans aren't allowed, but it's this place of like undefined.
Yeah. It's the fact that we are still part of the food chain and not independent from it is a little bit more obvious during that.
Yes, exactly. One of the reasons why we are here today is to also highlight a class that you've been teaching this summer. How would you like to articulate that? I've been just hearing all these wonderful like whisperings of like these wonderful philosophical conversations that people are having. So how would you like to articulate that?
What we've been calling the class is fungal ecology and philosophy. But really what's gotten incorporated into that a lot more than I originally anticipated is also a lot of queer theory.
Beautiful.
It's ended up being, and I mean, this is the cool thing that happens. When you study fungal ecology really is about studying relationships, and I think fungi make that super obvious.
Totally.
And so we have gotten into a lot of conversations through studying fungi and lichen in particular.
Interesting.
That have, led us into a lot of kind of conversations where we've gotten to reframe maybe what the self or the individual really is. So we've gotten to read some Judith Butler and this really incredible article called Queer Theory for Lichens that have both articulated a notion of the self and of the body as fundamentally relational. I think sometimes we think of the individual as, or what is individual about us as what is distinct or separate from other people.
Sure.
And I think they help to recontextualize that and actually say, we are composed of relationships. We came into being because of relationships, and we are never independent from that. And maybe we can actually think about, it's not that distinctness doesn't exist.
Of course.
But it's contextual. The reason that's even possible is because of the particular composition of relationships that compose and sustain us. And so, we've gotten to to talk about that. And we've looked a lot at the history of how certain organisms have also been described as scientists are trying to make sense of them while they're making these discoveries. Sometimes discoveries that have been known by indigenous people for a long time.
Naturally.
And dismissed as hyperbole, but...
We're just catching up.
Yes, we are. But with lichen, for example, a lot of the kind of early descriptions of lichen were very gendered. They were describing the algae and the fungi that were coming together as like a tyrant and a damsel, or a master and a damsel. And, there was a lot of language like that as people were trying to make sense of what that relationship was. Was it one that was exploitive? Was it one that was symbiotic? The term of symbiotic was just kind of coming into being at that point. And at each turn, we are seeing there was a lot of pushback from the scientific community towards any notion that actually you couldn't really pry apart the different components of this organism, that they had come together and collaborated to become something other than what they could be separately.
Right.
And part of the reason I think that pushback was happening was that when you use conceptual frameworks that we use to make sense of the human social world as well, and then those get challenged in what you're seeing with another organism, it's also a challenge to our own social organization and sense making. So if you have a lichen that really is a very queer being, that really challenges a lot of heteronormative ideals, thoughts about what is considered natural, or when you look at these organisms that are doing something called horizontal gene transfer, which is basically,
yes, let's get into
taking
terms.
taking on traits that aren't being passed down through kind of a parent kind of lineage.
Gotcha.
Then you can use that to also then look back at our own social world and say, well, maybe this can help us reframe how we think about kinship structures and family structures, that other organisms have found ways to pass on valuable information and continue to do kind of collaborative world making or family making that isn't just about genetic relationship. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of ways that, as we've kind of gone through this class, reading about the life ways of fungi and lichen, and then reading that in conversation with queer theory, have allowed us to actually kind of see deeper into both of those.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
You're incredibly articulate, by the way. I've always thought so, ever since I've met you. I'm curious, on a more personal note, so with everything that you just said, how has it impacted you the most in your life? Defining who you are or knowing who you are?
Fungi kind of came into my life at an interesting moment. I mean, obviously they've always been there. For quite a number of years, in my late teen years, early adulthood, I was very sick. I had Lyme disease, but I wasn't diagnosed with that, so spent a lot of years getting progressively more ill and having no one know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And just a very humbling experience, and quite scary, and had a lot of ambitions that I, at that point in my life, not to be melodramatic about it, but I just wasn't sure if they were things that I was going to be able to actually pursue, and there was a lot of kind of rethinking of what my life was going to look like. And, some of the symptoms that I had made it difficult to do school in particular.
Totally.
But also just to function as an independent adult. But it also gave me a lot of time to sit and observe the world around me, because I had just been in high school. I had all these plans. I was very busy all the time. I was dancing, totally. It was all good stuff, but I was rushing around from place to place, and this sort of brought me to my knees in a literal sense. And it's hard when you have something that affects your brain and your nervous system so much. I couldn't really remember anything and didn't have any energy, and just there wasn't a lot I could do. And so I spent a lot of time where I grew up just finding places on the land to sit and watch, or sit and watch isn't really the right word because it was more of a like holistic sensory experience.
Yeah.
But I got to experience the land day after day. And there's a lot I learned from that.
Totally.
And right about at the same time, you know, I was observing how things were working in relationship, and one of the things I kept seeing were things decomposing and the way that kept cycling things through. And, you know, one night my parents were gonna watch this documentary and I was feeling kind of glum, and they were like, you should just come watch it with us. It's about fungi. I was like, oh man, I'm not a big documentary person. Or at least I wasn't at that point in my life. And so it's like, okay, whatever. I don't have anything else to do. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this documentary. It's pretty well known. It's called Fantastic Fungi. Yeah, people talk about it all the time. I happened to see that and just got really hooked on this idea. Kind of two components of it. One was how these ecosystems are structured by mycelial networks, and the way that is actually kind of one of our oldest ancestors in a way, that they
totally
came to land before almost any other organisms besides maybe cyanobacteria, and like were able to, you know, digest rock in a way that could create organic material that could end up bringing plants to land. And like, it's a fundamental part of our story. I was fascinated by some of the research that was being done into psilocybin as a neurogenesis and helping people with terminal illness or other illness, memory kind of illnesses, to either come to terms with that or to do some rewiring in the brain. So it's interesting you brought up neuroscience, because that's an important part of my story, actually.
Wonderful.
As it relates to fungi. Around the same time, randomly picked up this book. What this book essentially offered was another method for rewiring my neural pathways. It was slower than using something like therapeutic psilocybin and as a neurogenesis, but it employed really a similar strategy in that it worked with the plasticity of the brain to, over time, make new affirming associations in the brain where there had been harmful ones before.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. So, you know, I guess fungi weren't directly involved in my healing, as in I wasn't ingesting them, but it always felt to me like I was really learning from the intelligence of an organism that has been around for, you know, millions of years, and like they've developed this capacity. And so I used them in my visualizations all the time. Like I pictured my own kind of neural pathways like fungal networks and thought about their ways of kind of creatively circumnavigating obstacles and creating life-giving connections. And
well, that also, I mean, visualization is such an amazing meditative technique that's been utilized throughout the ages.
Yeah, so it was, I think for me, it was really this combination of learning from the intelligence of another being, and I know that word is fraught, but it's the one I'm going to use, and also being kind of forced in a way to slow down. Even though that was painful, I'm so grateful for that, because it really allowed me to pay such close attention to other beings for a while. And that was really what spurred my interest in getting to know plants, fungi, animal, you know, any other living being, in a way befriending, like developing a personal relationship with the organisms and ecological relationships that are in and around me. And I feel like because I associated that, initially learning that with healing, I have also thought of making those personal connections, or like cultivating a sense of ecological belonging, as a really crucial part of doing broader cultural and ecological healing and repairing our relationships with the rest of the living world. Yeah, does that answer your question?
That is such a phenomenal answer, and I appreciate you being vulnerable in the answer as well. We all have interests in things, but there's always a connection to some deeper internal, you know, struggle that we're having. And I'm always curious about having those conversations with people because that makes it more tangible. I feel like to not only teach, but for people to learn. And I also had two of my best friends in Austin have Lyme, but I would always feed them this type of tea whenever they would have, you know, hard times. And so
L-theanine.
L-theanine, exactly. L-theanine is the key.
I struggle sometimes with how to articulate that part of my story, or like that connection between fungi and that period of my life. Probably doesn't help that I can't remember most of it, but like
I think you did a great job.
It taught me how to pay attention in a slow kind of way.
Well, that's what struck me as you were talking.
Yeah.
You know, particularly if you had like a fast-paced lifestyle previously,
Yeah.
and it was helping you slow down and observe, and
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful.
It's something we've talked about in the class too, actually, is the way that climate anxiety and a lot of, there's a huge sense of urgency around
Yes.
what to do with climate solutions. And one of the things we looked at in the class is what's called myco-remediation. So different ways that people are utilizing the
Rachel was telling me about that,
the incredible capacity of fungi to break down most toxic materials that we've created.
Do you mind going a little more into that?
No,
because
I can.
that topic is very fascinating.
Yeah, they break down plastics and pollutants, and in some ways, it's not always what they would choose to
like,
maybe
if
eat.
I have to.
The language that some scientists have used is that they can basically train certain strains of white rock fungus to learn how to digest these things. And part of that is that they've had, millions of years. And with this capacity to do horizontal gene transfer where they can pick up traits, they have millions of years of genetic knowledge to know how to break things down. So sometimes it takes them a little bit to figure it out. You might inoculate, a pile of trash with white rock fungus and they're not going to do anything with it right away. But then they kind of, for lack of a better way of understanding this, like flip back through all their millions of years of files of what do I do with this material if this is my food source, and figure out a way to break it down. If we and other animals, we ingest our food and then we break it down, they do the opposite. They output acids and enzymes that break materials down and then they absorb it. But that's one way that fungi is being used in like kind of toxic cleanup, but also there are all these ways that it's being utilized now to make building material and microfabrication, creating all sorts of products to kind of replace these, plastics and things like that, packaging and plates and all sorts of stuff. But one of the kind of complex things that we've been talking about in the class is that really partnership. Some of the questions that kept coming up in the class is how do we learn from the skills and capacities of other organisms and embrace those without slapping on the framework we've been using already and treating them in a new way as inert. Going back to climate solutions, there is this huge sense of urgency and the need to innovate. And also, I think sometimes what takes center stage or what takes precedent is technological innovation in ways like that, not necessarily this whole other component that it's still urgent, but it actually requires slowing down, which I think is counterintuitive. I don't think, personally, that we're going to make the changes that are necessary by just creating the right technologies. I think that...
I will second that.
Yeah. One of the most important things that's ever happened to me is the fact that for a chunk of time, all I could do was pay attention to other beings. And I learned to do that really well. And I could not have done that if I was trying to do things quickly. It's something I contend with a lot when I do scientific work for other organizations. It's like you're trying to collect data, you're moving at a pace.
Right.
And I'm like, wait, but I want to get to know that. My mom always jokes that she would take me for hikes a lot when I was a kid. From the time I could walk, we would go for hikes, or she would put me in one of those things that you put on your back. And she said it was painfully slow and taught her to be really patient. But we would take 4 hours to go a mile. I mean, granted, I had short legs, but but also I would monologue. I had to talk to everyone, and by everyone I mean every plant, an animal, an insect, and nice looking frog. And I had this I didn't even you know, I was not talking to her. I didn't care she was there.
Right, yeah.
I've
got better things to do.
I was like, these are my friends. I have to check in with everyone. I want to see how they're doing. Oh my gosh, here's this person I've never met before. I've got to learn something about them. And so I would do this as I would go on hikes. And my mom was in school learning some herbalism stuff at the time. So she had these plant cards at home. And she only told me this story like a year ago. I don't remember it, and I've never heard it before then. But she had these plant cards, and I would come back from these hikes, and I would go get the plant cards, and I would play with them, and she would go do, you know, other work. And then she came out into the yard one day to like see what I was doing, and I'd arranged them in this like weird non-pattern, you know, like they were just in weird clumps, or kind of some of them were close together and other ones were far apart. And she was like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, well, let me explain. I'm like 3 years old. This plant next to this plant, because they like to live together. And this one is down by the creek. And this one's up on the mountain because they seem to like a lot of sun. And I had mapped out the relationships of the ecosystem.
That's fantastic.
And so I knew how to do that. You know, I knew how to do that as a kid.
Yeah.
And then, 15 years later, I got to do it all over again.
So this is full circle.
It was full circle.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's huge importance to actually slowing down and taking the time to get to know other beings personally and developing that relationship. I think that goes a huge way to working counter to the narrative that they are not animate or
Right.
don't have anything to teach us, or because their style of communicating who they are and what information they have to share is not through language and not through the English language in particular. You know, like it goes a long way to realize that the onus in some ways is on us to broaden our concept of what communication is and then learn how to pay attention to what's being communicated. And you can't do that by going in with your data sheet and seeing, you know, whether the leaves are lanceolate or ovate. You know, like, that helps you get to know them. It just scratches the surface.
I love your story and how you've been able to deal with your own internal processes so that you can be a more effective activist and just human being in general. I love that you dance with plants and all that. That is beautiful. And this feels pretty conclusive to me. This can be like part of a series too that we do. And so if there's like things that are like, hey, I've got new ideas for part 2 or part 3, then we can do that as well. Well, beautiful. Any final words for the listeners?
I'll just leave a silence as my final words so that you can listen to whatever other beings are talking around you.
Beautiful. A reminder to everyone listening to this, find the stillness in your heart, observe the monumental beauty around you, because it's there if you pay attention.